and also for the warm welcome. I see a lot of new faces, so nice to meet you. I'm actually excited to have a chance to have the possibility to present some ongoing work to you today. Can you hear me, like also from the other side over there? All right. So today I'm gonna, so there was a lot of trust and human cooperation already in the introduction. Today I'm gonna talk about this tangentially, but I'm also gonna zoom in the role of institutions that have to kind of mitigate favoritism in trust and cooperation. And this is ongoing work with Vanessa Clemens and Andreas Glockner from University of Cologne. So cooperating is costly. So when people decide to cooperate, they're basically facing a risk that their cooperation is going to be exploited by strangers. But despite that, decades of research in human cooperation show that people display a remarkably high tendency to trust and cooperating with others they have very little information about. But also what decades of research also display is that where they're given some information about others, they show a systematic tendency to trust and cooperate more in a more favorable manner with people that they consider themselves close to, or they would consider as member of their group. This is called like favoritism or parochialism in this kind of literature. And if you think about that, and if you think about the challenges that as humans we're facing right now, for example, trying to mitigate the threat of climate change or curbing the spread of a disease, this kind of favoritism is very challenging because we need to cooperate with others outside our entrusted networks in order to address global issues like that. This tendency is also widespread across society. Here, these heat maps show an index of favoritism that is used in the past, and as you can see here, it's visible still from the map in countries or societies with a darker shade of blues. They present like a higher level of favoritism, and those like lighter one a lower level. And for those of you who are familiar with country-level indicators, what you can already see at glance by looking at this map is that it resembles what you would expect if you would plot any indicators that display institutional quality. For example, the level of corruption. You would see like a corrupt country, more corrupt country displayed in these dark blue colors. And indeed, that's also something that was found in the literature, is the fact that there is like a strong correlation between some indicators of institutional quality and this tendency to display favoritism. And this has been identified in the literature as the material security hypothesis. So this is like a theory that is grounded in evolutionary psychology, and is basically claims that institutions can be a driver of favoritism. This is based on the idea that institutions mitigate threats that we face in social interaction, especially in social interaction with strangers, and that if institutions work well, so high-quality institutions actually make some investment in entrusted small circle of others less necessary. So when institutions work well, people would feel more inclined to step out of these entrusted networks and actually trust and cooperate with others more. So parochialism, or this tendency to favor close others, is a form of social insurance, according to this perspective. But the empirical evidence on this, it's a bit mixed and inconclusive, especially when it comes to behavioral outcome. And here I'm going to focusing on one study that is like particularly crucial to the reasoning for this precise project. So in this study, participants from 17 societies were playing a trust game with each other. It is like an economic game in which a sequential one in which people are matched together, and this a sequential game in which this trust person is endowed with some resource and is given the chance to donate some of them to a return person if they want to, and these resources are then multiplied. Here in this project was tripled. And this return person can then decide to send something back. So this, in the first step, we can capture trust. And this was used in this study. This study was also actually inducing favoritism, manipulating it in a between-subject way. So participants in the role of the trust person were interacting with a return person that could be from their own country, from a different country, or a stranger, meaning from one of the countries that were involved in the study. And in-group favoritism in this study was captured as a differential score with that was obtained by subtracting trust toward national in-group minus trust toward the out-group or the strangers altogether. So, this study operationalized institutional quality in two ways, either with country-level indicators that is more in line with what was done in previous studies. So, for example, the level of government effectiveness or rule of law at the country level, or more recently, using individual level measures of perception of institutions. And specifically here, we tested the idea of institutions as trustworthy, as benevolent, and as able actually to mitigate these threats. So the studies show that this first study showed no relationship whatsoever between the indicators of institutional quality and the favoritism in the trust game. And the second study actually showed the opposite trend. So participants who reported to trust the institution more also displayed higher levels of favoritism in the trust game. So we were puzzled by these findings and wanted to dig a little bit deeper. What we noticed is that if you think about that more carefully, the national institutions actually can regulate social exchange within the nation, not across boundaries like it was done in the previous studies. And also looking at the literature more closely, we realized that the original authors also defined parochialism, so favoritism, as the broad tendency to rely on cues of social closeness in guiding behavior. So then we decided to make like a more refined test based on this idea and test this idea of closeness-based favoritism. So we try to conceptualize favoritism based on closeness and not on group membership as it was done in previous studies. And also, importantly, this time we focus on within country interaction. So not like as I described you before. And we did that and test two hypotheses. So first of all, we expected individuals to display higher amounts of trust and cooperation toward people who they perceive as close compared to strangers, right? That would make sense. We wanted to test this. And then to test the material security hypothesis more precisely, we expected that participants who reported more to trust more their national institution would display lower favoritism toward close others in this setting. And we test this hypothesis using data from two studies. Both studies were conducted online using professional panel providers, and the samples were representative for age and gender. The first study only focused on data from the United States. There were a bit more than 300 participants. And in the second study, we actually could harness the power of recruiting participants around 25 societies spread around the world. And actually, like those were societies that differ to some degrees in institutional quality. For example, here was a rule of law that was displayed. And here, so we decide to operationalize trust and cooperation using a prisoner dilemma paradigm instead, a continuous one, and hypothetical, in which basically participants were matched together. They're both endowed with some monetary resource, and they're asked to make a simultaneous decision to donate any amount to the other person. Whatever amount donated is actually then multiplied. Okay. Then we induce this closeness-based favoritism, basically asking participants to make the decision toward a person that they perceive, they consider themselves close to, or a randomly chosen person from your own country. So remember, those are all within country interactions. And that's like an hypothetical measure. Then we assess trust and cooperation using both the expectations of the other person cooperation within this scenario, and also the actual contributions toward the other person. So I mentioned that this was indeed an hypothetical decision, but we were lucky enough to have within this broader data collection some data about their contribution in the very same prisoner dilemma that was actually economically incentivized, so in which participants were actually paid for the decision with strangers. So we correlated this incentivized decision with our hypothetical decision toward a stranger, and we found that the correlations both for trust and cooperation were still very high. So that made us like even more confident about the validity of this method. Then we assessed individual perception of institutions and specifically institutional trust. We asked participants to answer a series of questions about national institutions. And then we assess this closeness-based favoritism in a similar way to what I did to the study that I described before, using a differential score. So having like this trust or cooperation toward the close other minus the stranger. Here we would expect that higher scores in this indicator represent more favoritism. Okay, so I hope you're still with me because I'm gonna show you some results. So let's start from like the first hypothesis. We are trying to understand whether people display some closeness-based favoritism in the first place. And from the results of study 1, you can see that that's the case, although like these differences are fairly small. So here you can see that participants decide to, in this case, cooperate more with the close other as compared to a stranger, although the scores, again, were like the difference is pretty small here. We test this very same pre-register hypothesis across the 25 societies. So here we have like a multi-level model in which we predict trust or cooperation using the target, so either the close other or the stranger as a predictor. And basically we find that across almost all countries, there is like, again, this tendency to trust the close other more, except for 3 countries in which there is a reverse pattern, although very small, specifically in China, in Turkey, and in Thailand. Okay, so we did find evidence overall across societies of this closeness-based favoritism. But then what happened if we, when it comes to testing what's the relationship with institutions? What's the relationship with institutional perception? So we test this second hypothesis. We would expect that participants who would report to trust institution more would display lower favoritism toward close others. And in the first study, that's exactly what we find. So here, for the first time in a behavioral setting, we actually find this negative relation. So participants who reported more trust actually displayed less favoritism. Yes. Exactly, because as I show you today, so as I show you before, the difference were very small, like in the very first figure. So you would find scores that are approximate to 0 when the difference is really not that huge. And here you can see that with the data points. Okay, they're more or less around the mean. Yes. So you interpret it correctly. But please ask any other clarification questions along the way. Does it clarify? But that's why I like to show the data points. We need to see that, right? Okay. We test the same hypothesis on the second study again on the set of 25 countries, and what we find is again consistent. So here these models basically predict the levels of trust of the favoritism, the differential scores in trust and cooperation with institutional trust. And we find again like some evidence for this that is in line with the pre-register hypothesis. A different way to look at the same results is not using differential scores, but really focusing on trust toward close others and strangers. And what you can see here is that with increased levels of institutional trust, this difference between the red, which is close other, and the blue, that is stranger, is reduced. So we find like more of a difference at low levels of institutional trust, according to what the material security hypothesis would predict. Okay, so again, like here, we use some measure of institutional perception, but then like what has been like done the most in the past was to use like country level indicators. So as an exploratory in an exploratory fashion. Now we also try to use some country-level indicators of institutional quality and see whether we would find the same pattern. So we selected some. We focus on country-level rule of law as a proxy for institutional quality, and we actually find again the reverse pattern. So here we found that country-level rule of law was associated to higher and not lower favoritism. So this is against the pre-register hypothesis, but it is consistent with with the findings that I showed you before using the trust game, and goes in the opposite trend. So I'd like to report and present these findings to you because I'm particularly interested in this mismatch between the perception and the objective levels. So this was like an indicator that was extracted by the World Bank, and basically captured the extent to which in some specific societies people abide by the rules and the institutions treat their citizens in a fair manner when it comes to apply the law. So it's like countries in which the law works particularly well, we can say in a simple way. Okay. So yeah, I would like to wrap up and show you what are some take home from this set of findings that I show you. So here, for the first time, when it comes to behavioral evidence, testing this prominent idea that institution can mitigate the tendency to favor in-group members or close others, we actually provide support for this idea. But we do that when we focus on favoritism based on social closeness rather than membership-based favoritism, which was something that was consistently done in the past. So it really looks like the material security hypothesis can operate based on cues of social closeness, and categorical group membership in the social psychology kind of way with in-group, out-group distinction might be a bit less appropriate when it comes to institution. Now we are basically trying to planning some studies and running some studies to replicate these findings, but in an experimental and more controlled setting. Specifically, we want to manipulate closeness, because here, remember, it was like an hypothetical item, thinking about a close other versus stranger. We want to now do that in the lab and incentivize actually economically these decisions. And importantly, we want to design a paradigm that would allow us to have institutions that can actually regulate the social exchange within the interaction. And we can do that, for example, using a third-party punishment paradigm. So having an institutional third party that within the game that can administer sanctions based on the behavioral participants within the task. All right. So I'm right on time. I would like to thank you for your attention, but also thank again like my collaborators, Vanessa and Andy. And there is time for questions. I'm looking forward to it.
Really nice presentation. I was thinking of how there might be, in some situations, of exploring some individuals, a mismatch between trust and in-group favoritism, or even between the way that people report trust generally about their society versus trust in, let's say, behavioral experiments, because you can generally say, like, if you're a report, if it's a self-report, abstracted from an actual scenario, you can say, I really like people from my country, we're amazing. Or you can say, I generally trust people in my country. Potentially, you could even say, I really like people in my country, but we're a bunch of thieves. We're all corrupt. And I wonder how that may translate to actual behavior in economic games. Because in this game, from what I understand, you can have no cues and you have to make a decision. You can have the cue of someone being from another identity or being within your same identity. So in that case, people might look for anything that is relatable and close to them. I understand the point here. I wonder how let's say, their perceptions of their culture and nationality in trust and in favoritism that translates into the behavior itself within the experiment.
So if I understand correctly your question, you would expect that in investigating this, for example, sticking to like a survey, kind of a self-report kind of method, you would find like consistent findings because it's on a similar, it's basically on a similar scale. And then like when it comes to like operationalizing it with a behavior, it might not relate exactly with it might pick up on different cues, and those that are experimentally induced rather than the network one. Actually, that's why we're planning to put it all together on an experimental setting, which the institution operates within the experiment. We're trying to do that for this very specific reason, to have like a very high internal validity, because indeed, like your argument, it's something that is recurring in the economic games literature, and is about like the ecological, more the ecological validity, and to what extent it is applicable to.
I think that's really good. That's precisely what I'm. When you have people making more abstract decisions in their lives, for example, how much trust do I actually have for my people that might, for example, decide how you behave politically when you're not dealing one-on-one with a person. What you're studying here is more like what you deal when you deal one-on-one with a person. But yeah, if you include maybe institutional elements that might make it a bit more complex and more social,
Okay, I'm glad it answered your question, but it's a valid point, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the presentation. We enjoyed it. And, me and Hannah started a PhD on trust last week, so that's very topical and timely. I have two questions, very short. In your conceptualization of institutional trust, you included both orders, institutions, and replicating. Was there any difference in the effects that would expect social closeness or social effects both for orders, at least police and judges and so on?
Yes, so we didn't find like any difference. So eventually we decided to aggregate them in means course of institutional trust, regardless of the institution. But the theory would also expect like a relationship with trust when dealing with institutions that deals with law and order. So that we would find like we would expect stronger association. That was not the case in the data. So.
And also, this mentioned about trust. I would suggest that so in the way that people for trust, they're perhaps not evaluating the government, and especially I don't know if that's the other like country level indicators besides the procedural indicators. So perhaps let's see economic.
We haven't tested it here, like in this specific project, because we haven't pre-registered that. We were focusing on perception, but in the studies like in Romano and colleagues 2017 and 2021, they did that with different indicators. So they use like government effectiveness, that is like something that is always used, but then they also use like, I think like economic wealth operationalized as GDP. So they use like institutional quality as economic wealth as a proxy. And also with economic wealth, they did not find like any significant association whatsoever. So it was very similar, but we haven't tested it here. We will.
Yeah, thanks so for being here. I hope my question makes sense because it's exhausting. Really more. If I understand correctly, your operation group relates to national identity that you these flags, right?
In previous work.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh. And so there's also this relationship that so my question is about why use this flag as a way to place a group versus out group dynamics versus particularly in a adverse country, it might be that flag might be
already about we've seen.
So I fully agree with that. And indeed, the experiment that used the flags to characterize the groups, so like on a membership-based, that was like membership-based favoritism, that was based on national membership. That was like something that was done in the past, and that's something that we are trying to overcome with our manipulation of closeness-based favoritism. So in this second study, we're focusing on within country interactions. Flags are not mentioned anymore, nationality is not mentioned anymore. We ask them to think of a close other or a stranger from the same country, just to avoid that. Because indeed it's true that in some specific countries, I think like we analyzed that we had some data in this in the other study with the trust game and the flags that also assess like the identification with their own nation. It was very strong in some countries, like such as the US. It was one of the strongest, but was very weak in some others. So that's also like that's a reason like to also go a little bit beyond this. And I agree, that's not the most suitable way. Yes, there are like some difference because if you use the flags, so in the 2021 Roman and colleagues paper, they use like a large set of countries, like there were more than 40 countries, and the national membership-based favoritism was consistent and strong across all the societies that were in there. Okay, so that was like a very universal phenomenon that was displayed. If you look at the closeness-based favoritism, it actually elicited like much lower effects, so like a much less favoritism, and also was flipped in some countries. So the membership, the group membership that was elicited using nationality and flags is actually strong. So we find stronger effect in using the flags than this.
Thank you. Wondering about your personalization. So the question you ask. So you ask about a person you would consider yourself close to.
Yeah.
And I was wondering to what extent do you think people could interpret that in different ways, and maybe within countries, but also between countries. For instance, it could be about a person you consider yourself close to in terms of you like that person. It's friend, whatever, so you can imagine a friend, or someone who is like you in terms of social economics, ideas, etc. And that could, of course, have a very strong effect, the way in which you interpret that question. That's my first question. And the second one is, I would be very interested in an exploration of the effects of different aggregate level measures, like you also said. So, for instance, I mean, it's not pre-registered, but I could imagine that, for instance, not so much GDP maybe, but the extent, the strength of the welfare state, for instance.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would be very interested in also seeing a bit of those explorations.
No, thanks for your comments and questions. So regarding your first point, this is also something that we wondered, of course, afterwards, right, as it always happens. Even like we thought, even at the idea of the trust radius, those that deal with trust might be like more familiar with it. And it's like, okay, what are actually people thinking when you ask to think about how much do you trust others? Maybe they have already like some conception. They might imagine people that are close to them or distant, and indeed asking directly about a person who they consider close, it's also like ambiguous in a way. We don't have an item or a measure that could tell us empirically what was going on in the minds of the participants, and also that's one of the reasons in which we are now thinking of like two ways in which we could elicit this closeness experimentally. So we are trying to elicit it using like the incentives in the game, and so that there is going to be like a very little room for interpretation, and we're gonna just narrow it down. So that's not something that we can disambiguate, and might be actually the origin of like those flipped effects, those flipped trends that we observe in some countries. Yeah, that's a good call. And your second comment was more about the other indicators. I agree. This is the fact that we're not pre-registered. It doesn't mean that we're not going to explore it. We're going to explore it. It's just I don't have the data right now to show you, but it will be done. But if you have like even like specific ideas of some dimensions of institution that might be more relevant for this kind of
Yeah, I think something like welfare,
yeah.
but also political variables like the rule of law, because I think many people much less relevant when it comes to institutional trust, right? So in many countries where the rule of law is like work really well, people can be very dissatisfied. But I forgot the specific indicator from the political establishment or
yes.
whatever. So I think that there's a bit of a mismatch there. So you might want to focus on political, on aggregate level measures that are more closely related maybe to the perception. Yeah.
It's a good call, and we're gonna do that.
Sure. Or maybe second, I'm not sure if one or two bigger questions, so others are. Yeah, sure. Right. Very nice. Thanks. It's fascinating. Also learned a lot. It's I was just triggered by the discussion that was already started about diversity and operationalization.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me wonder, curious about the other item, which Matthijs didn't mention, right? A random person from your country, right? And I started to wonder what that might bring to mind. Maybe I'm sure that's something, of course, you thought about, but especially if there's maybe sort of the diversity and the polarization within country heterogeneity, basically, that might bring to mind different things. So I was thinking there's some of those societies where there's equal sharing or trust towards the random person and the person you're close to. I guess are those that make societies that in some other way people project more of themselves onto the random their society or something. If you're more less polarized on how much in the societies in some social, economic, or cultural way or something, that confounding might that be behind the reverse correlation that you find, or you could think about that, or
so when we thought about that, or like to when we were considering the idea of the trust radius that I was mentioning before, we weren't thinking about heterogeneous societies or polarized societies per se, but but the same reasoning would still apply in that circumstance. So it's a possibility that in those societies people have actually like a precise idea in mind. Actually, like our phrasing of like think about a random person from your own country is already much more precise and much more narrow than what usually done in the literature. Because when it's about interaction with strangers, even in the previous study that I show you, they're very vague. They just say like it can be is like a person that you don't know. Okay, and that's it. Like that's the level of information that they get, and this might also like involve like, okay, so what are they actually thinking? So we try to put like a cap, having like you in your own country as to narrow it down, but still in some countries it might be like less effective than others. So I don't know if that was enough, but that's again why we're trying to bring it to the lab and do that experimentally, because there we can really have control over the group. There are not all these confounds related to nations, and then we can go back to this kind of data with that kind of knowledge. Yeah,
I can imagine there's very little you can do with that power to look within. It might be Ricchio's interested in maybe if a subgroup is split by median polarization among some level, and within the low polarization context on whatever metric, that relation is still in the unexpected direction. And if that's still the case, then I guess that would go against that interpretation of what might be going on.
So I think like indeed it might be a little bit underpowered still, but one possibility would be like even to get some aggregate measures for like ethnic heterogeneity or the polarization, if that exists, and put it like in the model and see how it interacts. Yeah. Although like for an interaction, again, it's really not super powered, but then like it might still like suggest some trends. That might be like a way to test it. Yeah, good. That's a good idea, I think. Thank you.
There's nothing to do with your presentation, but if I understand the effect sizes, they were relatively small. And I wonder, is it something to do with the research design, how I understood it, and the relatively big disconnect between trusting a stranger and how to approach institutions? I'm thinking about, so in the Netherlands, right, we have certain groups have had very good reasons to distrust the government. But I wonder if you would ask this, so we have had the tax evasion, the tax scandals. I wonder if you'd ask these people if they would trust a stranger, whether or not, like, I mean, this stranger on the street, they would probably trust, but it comes when there's a hierarchical dimension, it's a government organization, then there's something else coming in. So I wonder if the relatively small effect sizes are also a product of a relatively disconnect between the two concepts, and the fact that me trusting a stranger is something very different than how I approach the rest of my life in a society.
So yes, I think that's possible. Although, like from the literature on institutional trust, we can expect actually strong and positive correlation between like trust toward the state level institutions and trust toward strangers. And actually, that has been like kind of investigated, like both like in a large scale surveys. So those things goes usually like together, hand in hand, and also in experiments. So I wouldn't expect like a big disconnect there. And maybe, okay, like the disconnect might be a bit bigger because here we have like a behavioral paradigm and we're still assessing trust toward like existing state level institutions, but we should expect that they go a little bit hand in hand.
That is to stop before right?
Correct. Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's what this is always difficult with self-reports, but the fact that people in a survey say that they're probably in the same block, that these things go together, doesn't mean I wouldn't know. I don't know if you need to pick that against. That's these things that logically come together in the survey. So could it not still be that in people's real life, as soon, I mean, if you have no power relationship with each other, there's a very different level of trust. Then once it becomes more vertical, somebody has something to say about it. Let me say this in a university context. I stand in the elevator with somebody that I don't know, or I sometimes know that it's like the rector or does that affect my trust? My trust in you?
Yeah, absolutely. That would affect it. Yeah. I agree.
One way to maybe think about it going forward, right?
Yes.
Like, so a stranger that is somebody like you in the same role, or give that stranger some form of power.
So then, like, this would be like to test this idea of favoritism, but it's not like about like the hypothesis of how the perception of institution affect the favoritism. Oh yes.
Repeat that.
Yeah. So no. It's no worries. No worries. I need to think about it a bit more. But what we're trying to do, like in the experiment, is to put like a participant in the role of an institution, so in which there is like basically some hierarchical power, and we're also going to assess the trust toward this person that has power within the interaction. So in a way, we will tap into that.
Yeah. Question. If you think about going forward, or maybe also this like do a role switch in your experiment, because I feel like if you find this effect,
yeah,
it would be interesting to see how people actually run calibrated in a way that people also are more trustworthy if they met you with another person that they're close to. or if people just blindly trust people, other people that they are close to, even though those people don't treat them any more favorably than strangers do.
I think it's a nice idea. Like we haven't considered like doing this switch of roles and examining the other kind of trustworthiness. It's I would expect similar results because usually those kind of behaviors are fairly correlated from what we know in the literature. But yeah, that might be interesting as well. I wouldn't expect it deviates too much though. Yes.
Maybe it's just a broader relevant question, but on what dimension? Because I think you can trust people in some regard and then not trust in other ways.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's too complex to get into before, but I'm thinking about trusting someone to not harm me versus trusting someone to be honest, trusting someone to follow through. So I think I'm getting a little lost in the broad conceptualization of trust.
Yeah, okay. This it's true. Like, I mean, trust is a multidimensional concept, and there are like different parts, and it might have like some like here, for example, the role of institution might be like more relevant for some and not for others. So that's something that we did not measure because we had like a very behavioral indicator for trust. But yeah, might be interesting to see like what dimensions might be more relevant. I have no strong a priori ideas about that though, but it's possible that it's with a different magnitude. Yes.
We're talking about closeness to others. I just think maybe theoretically I'm curious about the overarching argument to move to that as opposed to sticking to traditional things that we were discussing.
So that's we came like we thought about closeness when looking like at the papers again, because like there were like such inconsistent evidence, like there was repeated across studies. So we're like, okay, let's go back to the theory, and it's something that is really small and very very buried under like tons of paragraph. But at some point, people think about the authors really talk about closeness. It's not like a super well. There is not like a very, very strong argument behind it, but then we thought, okay, if we want to be super fair toward the original authors, that's the way maybe to test it. So that's also something that we are.
Closeness is in like that's also kind of
Yeah.
I guess I'm also.
So given that now we're trying to put it like on an experimental setting, we have to be like a bit precise with the definition. We are thinking of closeness based on the idea that with close others, we would expect that the outcomes of our actions are going to matter more for us. So if like with a stranger, whatever the stranger does is not probably going to affect me. But with a close other, their action are going to have like a higher impact on my life. So that's like the idea of like interdependent outcomes. And that's what that's the direction in which we're pushing the closeness argument in the next studies. So more like influence on my own outcomes. Yeah.
Just one idea, because if you're interested in institutional trust and trust between people,
Yeah.
And as you said, trust and concepts can be multidimensional. I was wondering, in this case, you have more of a transactional kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it makes sense to use it given that it has been just so thoroughly investigated in the literature. I was also wondering about the prisoner's dilemma and other similar cheating or cheating paradigms.
Yeah.
So the idea that you can cheat or you can be more civic, and another person can either cheat or be more civic. So if you have a tendency to be more civic, but you think the other person is cheating, maybe you also cheat as well.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where it might especially relate to entry level measures such as those that you were using before.
I don't know if it has been done, if it's part of
That's like an important consideration. That's why we are using like a one-shot game, meaning that we like capitalize on their initial expectation of toward this person they never met and they will never interact again. So their original perception, it's gonna be what drives their cooperative behavior. And otherwise, if we would have like more repetition, then like reciprocity based dynamics would come into play, and that would be a bit more tricky to disentangle. So one shot for this reason as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe it's just the angle which you're saying, but I wasn't really quite clear on the answer to the question we fielded earlier about about the how exactly you measure the trust. Are you only using observed behavioral measures? For
Correct. Correct.
I'm sorry?
Yes, that's correct. I'm trust toward which actor are you talking about right now? Toward the institutions or toward the others? So toward the institutions, we're using like a self-report. So with like some items that assess trust toward national institutions, other like local institutions or like state level law and order ones. And then like toward the other persons, it's like the behavioral paradigm.
Okay. So it seems to me like you might have for doubting some of the sorts of reports. So are you familiar with James Scott's work on politics?
No, please, I would be curious to know more.
So when people happen to exist in unequal kinds of social relationships, there's a strong pressure for the person who's on the bad end of this to behave outwardly in publicly some sort of way that they're with the rules and norms, even though they absolutely don't want to. But they do this because they know there's some kind of sanction if they don't publicly face in a certain way. But the moment that they're not observed, they'll start expressing their actual attitudes. And in fact, they may so far as to start attacking and destroying the evidence and property of the people who are they have a relationship with. And so I think that you should read these kinds of self-reports, at least in some cases, with a great deal of skepticism. Because maybe they observe you, the researchers, belonging to this a member of a particular class that they actually have antagonism.
Yeah, I mean, so your concerns are more like it's not only like limited to the classic social desirability argument, but also like relating it even with the experiment, like induced kind of norms, yes, I'm not particularly happy of using that. That's why we're trying with the experiment and not to ask it, but like to observe, like to really like capitalize on behavior of the institution, and then based on that, not rather there. I don't know if that would minimize your concern. Not to.
I guess this worry is just another restatement of some of the survey literature. How do we get accurate opinions?
Okay.
So I'm not proposing any kind of solution to it, but it's
Yeah.
I guess another version of a very serious perennial.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's like a kind of a bigger issue, and that's why we are trying to like use behavior instead, and to move away a little bit. But we also talked about the limitation of that approach. So yeah, we're trying to combine the two.
Let's go back to the visual that Rick asked the question about all of the data in Vido.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with this? I mean, there's actually, it seems from this angle that there are very few data points that are actually creating the regression line display here. And especially, I mean, you could almost draw a vertical line to zero to wrong, or you cover the whole wrong behavior there. This is what's going on, that people have complying with the experiment, or it's some behavior, interesting.
So given that, again, like for the others, how to read that, given that this is like the differential scoring favoritism, and so the difference between like trusting and cooperating with a close others minus a stranger, when we have like a concentration of data points around the zero, it means that people like said, okay, I want to cooperate with a stranger, giving I want to give like all my endowment to the stranger, and I want to give all my endowment to the close other. So that's like how to interpret that. And indeed, it's true that most of it is focused at the middle. So given that inducing this closeness-based favoritism, it's something that has not been done before. It's a bit tricky to tell whether like this is about non-compliance or this is about the fact that this manipulation just elicited a small effect. I might think that that's the second answer because like we also have like other in this survey, we also use the flags, and actually, like my co-authors had projects about cross-national interactions that are related to this question, and they still find like bigger effects in that circumstance. So that manipulation is behaving as expected. So the small difference here might be related to the closeness and how we elicited it, I think. Yeah. I don't know if it answered your question, but that would be my speculation.
My question was actually, I just wanted to ask what the baseline of trust was in cooperation with strangers and those others, because I was also thinking if it levels like itself out around zero, it's probably because people like, or it might be because people just trust it all, and then it might make sense, or you might have like some sort of ceiling effect, or to like raise the stakes a little bit for differences to show up.
So with the baseline level, like you mean like what was like the average more or less, right? I think it was around 50% of their share. Like, and that's like very consistent with what happened. People say like, okay, I'm gonna give half because I think it's fair. So I think it was around 50%. I'm not sure that we can interpret like any further evidence as ceiling effect based on that or not.
It might then be higher, like
Yeah.
all those at zero.
No.
Yeah.
It was not particularly polarized or more polarized than usual.
Just to add to the discussion that's already ongoing, I think meat makes a lot of sense that a lot of their survey skewed towards the middle. I don't guess that's not the way to put it, but that's overrepresented. I just wonder whether you have already, this is something I guess that brief you out, right? In this sort of stuff, whether that relation is similar over different parts of the distribution, right? So once you go away from that crowded middle, among those who do have some favoritism, is there a relation with trust in that subgroup, or
maybe like this might answer your question a little bit, because here we don't have the differential score anymore, and you can see like among like, for example, those with high institutional trust, then those scores are actually like close to each other, and then it's we actually like it's more the difference is more like for a low level of institutional trust. So that's like the what creates, I think, the difference.
Skepticism for strangers.
Exactly. The stranger is the blue one, and meaning that people tend to distrust the strangers when they also distrust the institutions, which is something that I was mentioning before. Usually they go like they're very much correlated, and this is also what these data show here.
Now that you said it, people have expressed feelings or trust more than trust the institution. What my question would be, it would just be a disposition to trust
So like I see why you're saying like accepting of the institution with favor cooperation.
Yeah.
And then it goes into the disposition of people just generally trust in everything.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, but so this is like something I was reading in the literature. One way in which it was investigated was to use like the patterns of migration. And so, for example, like what was displayed is that people who migrate, like also from like, for example, highly corrupt countries to Scandinavian countries, in which institutions work very well, they also adapt their level of trust toward others accordingly. So this means that there is really like a kind of a top-down kind of process here, with the institution also shaping like interpersonal trust. Otherwise, if that was the other way around, we wouldn't expect such big change in trust, in interpersonal trust when you move to different contexts.